Hi, my name's Dr. Danial Schecter. I'm a physician at the Cannabis Medical Clinic and one of the co-founders. Today we're going to talk about the mechanism of action of medical cannabis, what cannabis is, and how it functions in our body. The first thing we have to understand is what is a cannabinoid. The term cannabinoid is a general term that refers to an entire group or class of molecules. These molecules have a common structure, and there's different types of cannabinoids. There are cannabinoids that are actually found and produced naturally within our body. These are called endocannabinoids because they're produced endogenously. Then there are cannabinoids that are found in nature. These are found throughout nature, and they're called phytocannabinoids because they're found in plants. And then we have synthetically based cannabinoids. These are commonly used pharmaceuticals such as nabilone or Marinol. Now, cannabinoids are an integral part of the endocannabinoid system, which explains why cannabis has an impact on the body. The endocannabinoid system is a relatively recently discovered system. It actually plays an incredibly important role in many different areas of human physiology, in both normal functioning, but also in pathophysiology, when things go wrong. And we know that the endocannabinoid system plays a very important role in maintaining homeostasis across a wide range of different conditions, including sleep, pain, psychiatric diseases, and many others. Now, the endocannabinoid system is very similar to other systems, meaning that it has a number of different components. The first component are the cannabinoid receptors. That is what cannabinoids have to bind to in order to exert their function on the human body. Now, there are two types of cannabinoid receptors. They go by the names of cannabinoid receptor 1, or CB1, and cannabinoid receptor 2, or CB2. Roughly speaking, cannabinoid receptor 1s and 2s are distributed in different areas of the body. Cannabinoid receptor 1s are found mostly within the central and peripheral nervous system, whereas cannabinoid receptor 2s are found mostly within the immune system. Now, what binds to cannabinoid receptors? Well, those are cannabinoids. And there are two main cannabinoids that have been identified within the human body that can activate or interact with these receptors. They go by the names of anandamide and 2-AG. Now, aside from the endogenously produced cannabinoids, the cannabinoid receptors, you also have enzymes that will create the endocannabinoids and also degrade them once they have exerted their function. It's important to understand how the endocannabinoid system actually functions at the level of the cell, because that's where the pathophysiology actually happens. Now, what we're showing you here is a picture of two neurons. We mentioned that the cannabinoid receptor 1s are found mostly within the central and peripheral nervous system, so that means it takes place at the level of the neuron. Now, what the endocannabinoid system does is that it essentially functions as a synaptic circuit breaker. And it does that by acting in a retrograde signaling system. And it's important to remember that the endocannabinoid system functions as a synaptic circuit breaker because that's how we can get specific improvements in different conditions. And if we're thinking of different pathological conditions that need treatment, such as neuropathic pain, such as anxiety, such as spasticity, all of these conditions have a commonality of too much information or erroneous information going from one neuron to the next. So if we can effectively break that circuit or break that information going from one cell to the next, we can effectuate a specific result. So in this example, how the endocannabinoid system actually functions is that the cannabinoids are created on demand in response to cellular, tissue, and organ demands in the postsynaptic terminal, not in the presynaptic terminal, as is the case with most neurotransmitters. Now, once the endocannabinoids have been created in this postsynaptic terminal, they will diffuse through the cell membrane and attach themselves to the cannabinoid receptors that are found on the cell surface of the presynaptic terminal. Now, what kind of cannabinoids can interact with these cannabinoid receptors? It's both the endocannabinoids that we produce on our own, the phytocannabinoids that are found in nature, such as THC and CBD, and then it's also the synthetic cannabinoids. Once the cannabinoid receptor has been activated by a cannabinoid receptor, it will set off a signaling cascade. And at the end of the signaling cascade, what it will do is that it will put a stop to the release of neurotransmitters. It works as a synaptic breaker. So we can think that there's less information that is transmitted from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic neuron when the endocannabinoid system is activated. And this results in specific therapeutic effects, meaning that in neuropathic pain, there's less information going by, meaning less sensation of pain. In anxiety, there might be less thoughts going through. We'll have a decrease in anxiety and a decrease in overactive thoughts. And in spasticity or spasms, when there's too much information going from one cell to the next in the muscle, that will get broken and those muscles can relax. So that's why we call the endocannabinoid system basically a circuit breaker. What I'd like to do is show you a schematic of where cannabinoid receptor 1s are found within the central nervous system. This is important to understand because it has very important implications with regards to safety. In this schematic, we see that cannabinoid receptors are highlighted in green. The darker the green, the more densely populated you have these receptors. Now, we see that you have cannabinoid receptors in all areas, but in highest amounts in the cerebellum and in those areas of the brain having to do with emotion and memory. And that explains why when people actually use cannabis recreationally, they get unbalanced and they get giddy or happy or emotional. But what we also note in this schematic is that there are very few cannabinoid receptors within the brainstem. Why am I bringing this to your attention? It's because the brainstem is where we have cardiorespiratory drive, and there are a good number of mu-opioid receptors in that area. We know that providing too many opioids will stimulate those receptors in the brainstem, causing cardiorespiratory depression and death. The same is not true with cannabis. No matter how many cannabinoids we flood the brainstem with, it will never be sufficient to induce cardiorespiratory depression and death. And that's why we say that cannabis has a very high therapeutic index and is much safer than most of the commonly used medications as well as recreational drugs in society today. So now that we understand the term cannabinoids, we understand a little bit about the endocannabinoid system and how cannabinoids can effectuate specific therapeutic results, let's get our heads around what we actually refer to when we use the term marijuana or weed or pot. These are all slang terms. And they're slang terms that refers to a very specific portion of the cannabis plant. The cannabis plant is a genus of plant that has a few different species, including indica and sativa. And marijuana actually refers to the flowering buds of the female cannabis plant. This is where you have the highest concentration of cannabinoids. If you look at the flowering buds of the female cannabis plant, you'll find that it's covered in a resinous goo. Now, this resin, when analyzed, actually comprises over 450 different unique compounds. Of those 450 compounds, about 100 or 120 are considered cannabinoids, have that unique structure that can interact with the endocannabinoid system. Now, of those 100, 120 cannabinoids, there's really two that are found in higher concentrations than all others and are thought to be responsible for the vast majority of effects that cannabis causes. Those two cannabinoids are called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and cannabidiol, or CBD. Now, THC is the cannabinoid that is thought to be responsible for that stereotypical euphoria or sensation of high that you get when you use cannabis recreationally. In fact, cannabis that's being used for recreational purposes has been grown and selectively bred over the generations to have increasing amounts of THC to the detriment of all of the other cannabinoids, and specifically CBD. Now, CBD, while it doesn't cause that same type of euphoria, still has a role in medical practice. Now, aside from THC, CBD, and cannabinoids, the other most important group of molecules within the cannabis plant are what we call terpenes. Terpenes are a group of molecules that are aromatic, meaning they smell. And they're not unique to cannabis, they're found throughout nature, and they're actually what is responsible for aromatherapy. So if we think about common smells such as lavender, pine, lemon, these are all terpenes. And terpenes themselves have physiologic properties, and they can also impact how cannabinoids are experienced within the body. It's important to understand the differences and similarities between THC and CBD. We often say that THC and CBD are opposite but complementary. THC is what causes that stereotypical feeling of high or euphoria, and that's because it's a partial agonist at those CB1 and CB2 receptors. Now, CBD, on the other hand, doesn't cause that euphoria or impairment. And it can actually reduce the amount of feeling of high or impairment that you get with THC because it acts as a partial antagonist at those very same receptors. And that's why patients use different ratios of THC and CBD in order to achieve different effects. Now, just because THC does cause euphoria or impairment doesn't mean that there's not a role in medicine. THC has been shown to actually be quite effective to help in managing chronic pain, especially neuropathic pain, helping to control chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and spasticity, especially when it's secondary to central cord lesions such as MS. There's also some developing research suggesting that THC may be effective to help with sleep, especially when it's secondary to other chronic medical conditions. Now, CBD, on the other hand, is not just beneficial in improving the tolerability of THC. CBD itself can also be beneficial to help treat other conditions such as treatment-resistant epilepsy, especially in the pediatric population. And there's some interesting evidence looking at CBD as being anti-inflammatory. So this explains why we use it quite widely in chronic pain conditions that have an inflammation as its core component. There's also some interesting research looking at CBD as potentially being anxiolytic and even antipsychotic. So when we talk about strains of cannabis, we're often talking about the ratio between THC and CBD, and patients often use different strains of cannabis or different ratios of cannabis of THC and CBD at different times of the day. For example, a patient might want to use CBD only products in the morning in order to reduce inflammation and pain, whereas as the day goes on, as they develop more pain, more discomfort, they might use a product that has a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD.